for coming. Make sure you have a prayer prompter, and then we will be in Genesis chapter 41 this evening, and we're going to see some things turn around for Joseph. After all these years, after 13 years, things are turning around for Joseph, and then we'll read about that in Genesis 41. Let's go ahead and begin our service with a word of prayer. And then we'll jump right into Genesis chapter 41. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you with thanksgiving. We come before you thanking you for your invisible hand, which controls the events, the circumstances, the interactions with people. Thank you that you work in our lives for our good, through bad, through trials, through testings, that you are there, you are present, and you're preparing us for that which you're preparing us for. We ask, Lord, that as we draw near through your word this evening, whether it be in the chapel or the auditorium here, or with the teen chapel, or with the kids' expeditions program, we ask that you would minister your word through your Spirit, through your teachers, to the hearts of your people, that we would be changed, that we would draw near, that we would see who you are, experience your truth, and then live it out. Bless the time that we have together. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, Genesis chapter 41. Joseph the Statesman. That's the title of tonight's devotional challenge, Genesis 41. We're going to cover the whole chapter, so we have a lot to finish. We'll jump right in here. So Genesis 41, Joseph the Statesman. If you can remember, Joseph has interpreted the dreams of the chief butler and the baker in prison. And the interpretation of their dreams came true. The chief butler was released and reinstated, and he's right next to the king. And right after this event came true, Joseph, no doubt, is on cloud 9. He's spiritually skyrocketed because his interpretation came true, and he's looking for freedom from prison here. But he begins, I think, to trust too much or depend too much on man. Psalm 60, verse 11 says it in this way, give us help from trouble, for vain is the help of man. And Psalm 146, 3 says, put not your trust in princes, nor in the Son of Man, that is in humanity, in whom there is no help. So for 2 years now, he's waiting and waiting and waiting. He is forgotten by the butler. He was forgotten by the butler, but he's not forgotten by God. So Joseph is still working in the prison. He's waiting for something to happen. And so these 2 years have passed, but when things start to happen, they start to happen fast and quickly. I mean, things change on the drop of a dime here. And so God's time had come to activate his plan, and it started to happen, and the events started moving quickly. And so he is activating his plans for Joseph, and that's where we find ourselves in Genesis chapter 41. We're going to read verses 1 to 8. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine, or cows, or cattle, and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed kine did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat kine. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up on the one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. So here we have God now putting his plan to work, not Joseph depending on man. Right? This is God activating his plan. And remember what Proverbs 20 says. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. He turns it whithersoever he will. So he causes him to have this dream, and he needs an interpreter. There's a revelation to the Pharaoh from God, but he doesn't understand it because it's in the form of a dream. And if you don't understand the first dream, basically he sees 7 cows that are fat being devoured by 7 skinny cows. And then he sees the second dream, 7 thin heads of grain devoured by 7 healthy, he sees 7 thin heads of grain devouring 7 healthy ones. And so that's the dream, but no one to interpret. The magicians couldn't do it. The wise men of Egypt couldn't do it. So we have in verse 9, let's read verse 9 to 13. Then spake the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants and put me in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream. And there was there with us a young man, an Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. To each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. So we went from the revelation to Pharaoh, now to the remembrance of this cupbearer, or this chief butler. No one's able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. The cupbearer remembers, hey, when I was in prison, it happened, right? So again, God activating, initiating the plan. God causing people to come together in the right place at the right time for his people. And so that, to me, that's just a great and encouraging thought there. Now let's look at verse 14 as we see the Pharaoh reviewing his dreams to Joseph. All right, verse 14, we'll read to verse 24. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 kine, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and the ill-favored kine did eat up the first 7 fat kine. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them. But they were still ill-favored as the beginning. So I awoke, and I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears withered, thin and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, but there was none that could declare it to me. So he reviews his dream, brings Joseph out of the prison so Joseph can hear, and Joseph doesn't shed the spotlight on himself. Okay, you know, our president today, our president takes credit for almost everything, and he is the force for good. But here, Joseph's like, it's not in me. He doesn't shine the spotlight on himself. He's pointing it to God. It is God. God is the interpreter, as he says there. It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. So here we have a display of Joseph giving answer in humility and dependence on God. And here's an example that we should follow. Look, anything good, anything wise comes from God. God is the source of all wisdom, and we should acknowledge that where we work, where we live. Just declaring eagerly that God is the source, the true source of all wisdom. Now, if you look back at verse 14 here, here's a principle I think that we could take away. Here's an opportunity. Joseph is just serving. He was excited that the first day after his dreams were interpreted and came to pass with the chief butler, but he's waited for 2 years now. And every day he's working, every day he's serving. He's just doing what's before him. He's serving. He's living out faith in front of God and in front of man. He's serving man. And we see here that opportunities come when we least expect it. Okay? But you have to be ready for it. You have to be ready for it. Did Joseph have time to prepare? Yes and no. Right? I mean, boom. He had to go shave because during that day, the style in the Egyptian land was you were clean shaven. Okay? So he had to go shave. So he was prepared, and he was getting prepared in some ways, but he had no warning that, hey, a tap on the shoulder. You ready for this? He's not expecting it, though one day he's thinking God's going to do something, but he was ready when the opportunity came, and that's a good example for us. He was ready for almost anything because of this. He was faithful in a few things, and God gave him more. And when opportunity comes, you're already ready. Not because of you, but because you're already right with God and faithfully serving. Okay? Same thing that happened with me, how I got here, right? Probably the same thing that happened with you with certain jobs and certain places in your life, that you were ready. Okay? Sometimes we find stuff that we're looking for, because ask and you receive, seek and you shall find. And sometimes God brings it to us. We've asked, but we've searched, but then all of a sudden, just like this, Joseph, the king wants to see you. So when you're faithfully serving, God brings opportunity. You're ready for it because you're faithful. God rewards faithfulness. He was ready for almost anything because he was already right with God. So, the application we take from this is, look, be ready for opportunities. Be ready for opportunities because you're already with the right relationship with God. Now, what happens? The opportunity comes forth. Joseph recommends the solution not to get a job, right? I don't think that's why he was giving a solution in terms of appoint somebody, but we'll find this here, that Pharaoh wasn't a worshiper of Jehovah, but Pharaoh is also a good example. Okay, here is Pharaoh, who is the leader of a powerful country. Here is Pharaoh, he feels uneasy about a dream. Here is Pharaoh, who's humble enough to say, I don't know what this means. What does it mean? Here's Pharaoh, humble enough to say, okay, here's a Hebrew guy in the prison that interpreted a dream, bring him here. So he sees something in this man, and he'll say what he sees in this man in the next passage. Let's look here at verse 25. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, the dream of Pharaoh is one. God has showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good kine are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored kine that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears blasted with the east wind shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. And there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine shall consume the land, and the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of the famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that dream, the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So God reveals here, he renders the meaning, the interpretation of the dream through Joseph. And basically, Pharaoh's dreams are foretelling the events of the next 14 years. Imagine if you knew what was going to happen in the commodities market for the next 14 years. We would all be very rich if we knew what was going to happen in the next 14 years. You invest, you reinvest and keep reinvesting, and you avoid certain things. And so there is something here, right? He basically explains, look, these 7 years are going to be abundant crops, the first 7 years, and the second 7 years, it's only going to be a famine. So what do we do here? If you know something bad is going to happen, you ought to have a survival plan, right? Do we have any preppers in here? Anybody have any preppers in here? Probably we don't have any preppers in here, do we? Does anybody have 6 months of vitamin food and stuff in their pantry? We probably have about a week with our family. but if you know something like this is going to happen, you have to have a survival plan, right? And so here is Joseph. He gives the king a survival plan for the next 14 years. The only way to prevent starvation was through careful planning. So essentially, he tells the king, you're going to have a famine plan. Okay? Famine is coming. So if you don't have a famine plan, Egypt is going to, though a mighty country, is going to be reduced to dust because there will be a famine and it'll just be reduced to dust. So here's the problem with us sometimes. We don't like plans. Some of you are planners. Some of you are not planners. You're just doers. You don't plan. But planning and doing, okay, are necessary. Planning's a responsibility. Planning's not an option. Joseph here is about to save a nation by translating, this is God's plan, this is God's events, this is what's going to happen, and here are the practical applications of what we should do. This is what God says is going to happen, this is how you should prepare, right? So we have to take time to translate God's plan into practical actions. You know, you do that as a family, whether you realize it or not. You do that as an individual, whether you realize it or not. Some better than others, right? I remember my dad found me 3 a.m. one Sunday morning, or one, I don't know what day of the week it was, but he opened up the door in my room, and I had my whole life planned. You know, I had, okay, I'm going to graduate college from this time, I'm going to have this by this time, and this by this time, and this by this time. And he said, what are you doing at 3 a.m. in the morning? I said, I'm planning. I'm planning my life for the next 20 years. Okay, I think I was 17 at that time, 17, 18. But planning is an act of faith. It's an act of faith. I have to do that as a family, and I have to do that as the leader of a church. Okay, the deacons help me do that. Okay, we got many people, this much money. What can we do? How can we reach out? How can we do this? How can we save money here, there? So you have to plan. It is necessary. It's an act of faith. It translates God's promises into action. And so that's what he's about to do. Look at verse 33 as he makes the recommendation here. Verse 33. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out, a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. So we here have Joseph's recommendation. Okay, appoint someone to be the leader to store the food. Appoint some officers to help, because there's going to be 7 years good to be prepared for the 7 bad ones. So Joseph went beyond, okay, this is what it means, to this is what you ought to do. So here's the description, like a preacher should do. This is what it means. This is what you should do. This is the application. Get somebody to lead, appoint them. And so this took a great deal of faith and courage, right? Because here you're talking to, as far as you know, the greatest or the strongest man in the world, the king of Egypt, or the Pharaoh, and he's got a lot of people in a big army. What does he tell him to do? Look, get an intelligent and a wise person to oversee the land and the harvest, okay? Get some people to work under him, officers, commissioned officers, right, to different parts of the land. Take 20% of all the crops, store them for the next 7 years against the 7 bad years that'll come. So this is all practical application of how to respond to what you know will happen. And then if you can imagine, what did Joseph do when he was sold into slavery? What did he learn? Where did he serve when he was sold into slavery? He was in Potiphar's house, right? And basically, what did he do there? What does the manager of the house have to do? He buys food. He makes sure there's vegetables, there's grain. He makes sure, okay, where are we going to store this stuff? We're going to store this stuff to protect it against mold. We're going to store this stuff to protect it against vermin, mice, rats. So what was God doing? He was training him. Same thing in the prison, right? He was put in charge of all the prison too. So God was preparing him, and as he was faithful, God was preparing him for more. Okay, and so that's the picture here that, hey, you be faithful in a little, and God will give you more. And again, here is Pharaoh, I think, being a good leader. And so Pharaoh, right away, before everybody, let's look at verse 37. After Joseph makes his recommendation, the Pharaoh, it says in verse 37, and the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? ? So Pharaoh, again, being a leader and a good one and a humble one, humble enough to ask for help and humble enough to recognize not only is this guy a good leader and wise, but there's something more. He's empowered by God. Who can we find like this, right? Look, verse 39. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. So he recognizes the hand of God on this person's life. Okay, just like Laban recognized the hand of God on Jacob's life. Right? When you know that somebody is being blessed by God, guess where you should go? You should go right next to him because the blessing of God will overflow to you. And so this is what Pharaoh is recognizing here. No one is as smart as you, and the Spirit of God is on you. So I know. How about you? Right? Verse 40. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand and arrayed him in vestures or clothes or robes of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. You know, the thing with Joseph in his life, it's always about his garment. Right? It's always about his outer garment, right? Here's this coat of many colors. Let's take it off. Let's put blood on it. Tell Daddy died. Now he gets the Potiphar's slave garment on, right? And what happens with that garment? Remember? Potiphar's wife rips it off. Help, help, help. He raped me, right? So here's people taking off his garment. And here now, the Pharaoh is taking off the slave, the prisoner's garment now, and putting on the king, the prince's garment. Okay, as you faithfully serve, God changes you from the inside out, and he recognizes it, and he helps the world to recognize it too. So let's look at verse 43. Now, after he gives him his, the symbol of authority, the ring, the robes of authority and royalty, in the gold chain. So he's on the outside. Pharaoh is making it very clear and plain to the court and to all the people. This is now my guy. He is vice president. What he says, I say. Okay? My authority is totally behind him. In fact, I have Air Force One. I'm going to give him Air Force Two. Look at verse 43. And he made him to ride in the second chariot, right? That's equivalent to our president's Air Force One, right? The big protected plane. Here's Air Force Two, or second chariot. So no one else has a better chariot with authority and power, right? So he made him to ride in the second chariot, which he had, and they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paaneah. Okay, I think I got that right. And he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And so he goes on this tour lets everybody know, here's the new guy. Here's the new boss, and he looks the part. He plays the part, he looks the part, and Pharaoh, let him make it publicly known, this is the guy. He has my authority, and do what he says. So now let's look through this promotion here, think through it here. Joseph goes from prison to the palace, from a pauper to a prince. You got to start somewhere, right? And so this is what God does, and he does it sometimes very quickly. Sometimes when you look in ministry and people's lives, it's as if they've waited for a long time, and all of a sudden, boom, the door's open, and you blink. That's what's happened here. You blink. Yesterday he was in prison. Today he's the prince, and he's in the palace. And he's now married to a very well-respected daughter of a respected family in Egypt here. So what can we take away from this? In each situation of Joseph's life, though it seemed bad, a slave in Potiphar's house, a prisoner in the king's dungeon, it looks bad, but through it all, he learned to work and to serve. He learned to serve God and others. So whatever position you're in, whatever's happening with you, whether it's desirable or undesirable, consider it God's training program for you at this time, at this moment. God's training you. And God doesn't measure your success or your stewardship by success, but rather, not reputation, not success, not fame, but your faithfulness. When you're faithful, God promotes. Now let's find the end of the story here. Look at verse 47 as we look at the program. And in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much until he left numbering, for it was without number. It was so much you could hardly count it all. That's how good the crops were in those 7 years. Verse 50, and unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, which Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bare unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God said, He hath made me to forget all my toil in all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God hath caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended. And the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands, but all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all the countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy corn, because the famine was so sore in all the lands. And thus ends chapter 41. So what happens? He's married, he has 2 kids. Here we see spiritual growth happening in his life. Okay, 7 years of plenty, and in those 7 years of plenty, it was 13 years in prison before he met the Pharaoh. Then 7 more years. So 20 years now since he's left his home. And then there'll be 7 more bad years. So what's happened with him? He's had a son. The first son he names Manasseh. Manasseh means one who forgets. God has made him to forget his bitterness. He doesn't carry bitterness and anger with him anymore. Okay? Some people never learn that lesson. 60, 70, 80 years old and still carry a grudge. Still not forgetting and forgiving. So we have here his first son named one who forgets. So he's forgotten. How did he forget? We'll learn exactly in chapter 50, verse 2, where he says, yes, the stuff was bad, but God meant it for good. That's how he is forgetting. He's forgetting all the bitter things, the bad things that happened to him. And then he calls his second son Ephraim. Ephraim means double fruit or twice fruitful. So here's the picture. You know, when I do counseling, whether it be husband and wife or parent-child or individual with family or friends or church counseling or squabbles, one of the things the first thing I do is look, what's out there? Let's get it all on the table. What are you angry about? Let's put it on the table here. Now, you angry about this? Yes, yes. Now, what are you angry about? This, this, this. Now you two have to forgive each other. And what does it mean to forgive? Manasseh. Forgive and forget. In the Bible, to forgive means not to bring it up. Okay? Because if you don't bring it up, you know what you do? You keep a list. You remember and you bring it up. To forgive and forget, let's put it on the table. You say, I'm sorry for this, this, and this. Will you forgive me? This person has to say, yes. Not just yes, but yes, I forgive you. And then the other way around too. Now, once it's forgiven, I don't have to deal with it the next week at the next counseling session, unless if they bring it up because they haven't forgiven. Okay? And this is what Joseph has learned. Manasseh, God has made me to forgive and forget. And because I don't have this bitterness on my shoulder or weight on me anymore, I am Ephraim. I'm living to be fruitful. Twice fruitful. And there's no doubt in my mind that because he interpreted the other dreams, he has went back and interpreted his own dreams. And he's thinking, this famine is going to get my brothers and my family to come. And he is ready because he's forgiven them. And he's focused on being fruitful in his life and productive. He's not letting the weight of unforgiveness and bitterness weigh him down. And here we have a man, as I close here, Joseph. He believes God. He expected God to work. He expected his dreams to come true. He expected God to do what he said he would do. Here's an example for us. Being faithful in the small things, right? Being ready when opportunity comes. Serving, forgetting those things which are behind, reaching forth to those things which are before, fruitfulness, right relationship with God and God's blessing, expecting God to bless, and God does. The point where we'll see in Genesis chapter 50, talk about an emotional catharsis. He's already forgiven, but his brothers are there, and it has to flesh itself out. I'm your brother. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So much here. This chapter is just rich with application and truth, but so much for us as we go into prayer here. You know, if you have an issue with a brother or sister, hey, Manasseh, right? Forgive and forget it. And then let's aim at being fruitful, Ephraim. All right, let's look at any questions or comments, statements? Yes.
So, what scripture or information leading that he was bitter? Because my understanding is because he was that faithfully serving the Lord through all those difficulties. That usually when a person's bitter, they're not serving God faithfully.
Yeah, you know what? You're right. It's a little bit of a right here, it's a declaration that he's done it. A declaration of, I have forgiven. Yeah, I have forgiven. Or the Lord has made me to forgive and forget. You know what? The past is now behind me. I think it's just a declaration. It could be, it's possible that you're right that he wasn't bitter, but it may be possible because he's declaring it. Yeah, you know what? I think it's a spiritual growth and maturity. It's a beautiful thing. I mean, I couldn't imagine seeing, it's when people see their abuser for the first time after a few years after a person grows, they see their abuser, and at one point you wanted to kill him, and at the next point you feel sorry for him, and then when you're spiritually mature, you forgive him and you want him to grow. That's, we're all at different stages. I think I've shared it here with you. I was right in living for God when I got saved at the age of 23. I mean, I was like, whatever God says to do, I'm going to do it. To me, it was all or nothing, right? If God is real and Jesus is Lord, whatever he says, I'm going to do. And then I read Matthew 6 one day, where it said, Jesus is speaking, and he says, if you won't forgive men their trespasses, how will God forgive you yours? Matthew 6:30-something or 20-something. And so I was right with God and faithful and growing, but I had this anger against my father, who was an alcoholic, right? I remember during my college years, I did not want to be in the same room with the man. I mean, he took me out to a, coming home from college once, I was at a suitcase college, it was about 45 minutes away. He wanted to take me to a bar and have a drink with your dad, your old man, right? And I was just so angry. I'm like, no, I'll have a Coke. I'm not going to drink anything with you. But I got saved about a year after that. And God began to work on me, saying, this anger and this bitterness is wrong, even though I was living right. I was involved, whenever the church doors was open, I was there. If I could provide any leadership or service in singles ministry, I did it. And then this verse, Matthew 6, if you can't forgive men their trespasses, how will God forgive you yours? And that just weighed upon me. And the day that I said this, I didn't say, Dad, you sinned against me. I said, Dad, thank you for paying the bills, for putting food on the table and a roof over my head. I didn't bring up, you never came to a baseball game, you didn't go to my football games. I never said any of that stuff. I just said, thanks for being a dad. I had friends that didn't have dads, right? They're, living in ghettos and different things. But the minute I did that, there was like almost a second birth. In other words, the weight, the bitterness was gone, and there was a kind of a lightness of being. So I'm thinking here, yeah, he was living and serving and doing right, but you're never perfectly perfect, right? But you become more and more like Christ as you do what he says. And I think at this point here, if there was any bitterness, whether it be, little chip or big brick, I think he says, the Lord has made me to forget, and I'm going to be fruitful. I'm going to forgive and forget. I'm going to make something out of my life. And so I think that's what happened. That's a good point. Yes? Well, I think he did it masterfully. I think he did it to teach them repentance. So we'll talk about that. But yeah, I think it was a beautiful thing, I think, in his growth. But we'll talk about that in the next few weeks. All right, let's go to our